A former soldier, his career cut short by the shrapnel that now lived in his bones, returned to the one place he had sworn to forget, only to be paralyzed by the sight of a vulnerable victim in a horrific situation. There, in the desolate gray expanse of a cemetery parking lot, a small boy, no older than 3, stood alone beside a gleaming black SUV, his tiny hand resting on the cold tire as if it were his only anchor in a vast, indifferent ocean. The polished vehicle, a stark symbol of wealth and order, was a jarring contrast to the child's visible neglect. His thin jacket insufficient for the biting autumn wind, his face smudged with dirt and streaked with the silent tracks of forgotten tears. Why would a child be abandoned like a misplaced parcel in a place dedicated to the dead? And who, in this world of carefully constructed facades, truly deserved to be brought into the unforgiving light of truth? Arthur Vance felt the familiar, unwelcome chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of a memory, a phantom limb of grief that ached whenever he returned to this town. He had come to visit the grave of his sister, Sarah, a ritual he performed once a year on the anniversary of her death, a penance for not being there when she had needed him most. The drive had been a blur of skeletal trees and bleak, rolling hills, a landscape that mirrored the terrain of his own heart. He had parked his modest sedan at the far end of the lot, seeking solitude, but the universe, it seemed, had other plans. His gaze, trained by years of scanning horizons for threats, had snagged on the small, solitary figure. For 10 minutes he had watched, a knot of ice forming in his gut. No one came. No frantic parent rushed from the manicured lawns of the cemetery. The boy simply stood, a silent sentinel in a world that had moved on without him. Arthur pushed open his car door, the groan of the old hinges sounding unnervously loud in the quiet air. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, his limp barely perceptible, a testament to a will that had refused to surrender to his body's betrayal. As he drew closer, the details sharpened into a portrait of profound sorrow. The boy's hair was a tangled mat of blonde curls, the color of his late sister's. His shoes were scuffed, one lace undone and trailing in a puddle of oily rainwater. But it was his eyes that stopped Arthur cold. They were large and impossibly blue, the exact shade of a summer sky just after a storm, and they were utterly vacant. They were Sarah's eyes, but hollowed out, stripped of their light, their life. He felt a sudden, dizzying lurch, a temporal dislocation. He was seeing a ghost. "Hey there, little man," Arthur said, his voice softer than he had used in years, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's level, careful to keep a non-threatening distance. "Are you lost?" The child didn't respond. He didn't even seem to register Arthur's presence. His gaze remained fixed on some distant, invisible point beyond the iron gates of the cemetery. There was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his small hands. Arthur looked closer at his face, past the grime and the tear tracks, and saw it. A faint, yellowish-purple bruise, shaped like a thumbprint, bloomed high on his cheekbone, partially hidden by the fall of his hair. A cold, surgical rage began to build deep within Arthur, a familiar fire he had learned to bank but never extinguish. This was not a lost child. This was a discarded one. He looked at the black SUV. The license plate was a custom one, Ardenton Richard Denton, his brother-in-law, the man Sarah had loved, the man who had remarried less than a year after her death, the man Arthur had not spoken to since the funeral. This was Leo, his nephew, the child he had only ever seen in a single photograph, a smiling, cherubic baby cradled in Richard's arms. The boy in that picture was gone, replaced by this silent, haunted creature. The discovery was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He had come here to mourn the past, and instead, the present had delivered a new, more urgent horror to his doorstep. He saw the keys dangling from the SUV's ignition, visible through the pristine driver's side window. The door was unlocked. The sheer, breathtaking carelessness of it was an indictment in itself. He gently opened the passenger door and looked inside. A high-end leather car seat was installed in the back, but it was empty. On the passenger seat lay a sleek, expensive purse and a phone, buzzing silently with a notification. A woman's belongings. Eleanor's, Richard's new wife. Arthur's mind, trained for rapid threat assessment, began to assemble the pieces. Richard was at work, a high-powered executive in the city. The new wife, Eleanor, had the boy. She had driven here, to the very place where the boy's mother was buried, and had left him alone in the cold. For how long? He reached out, his hand hovering near the boy's shoulder before he thought better of it. He couldn't risk frightening him further. "Leo," he said, the name a strange weight in his mouth. "My name is Arthur. I'm your uncle." The boy flinched at the sound of his name, a small, almost imperceptible tightening of his shoulders. It was a reaction Arthur had seen before, in the eyes of children in war-torn villages who had learned that to be named was to be singled out for pain. He knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones like a permanent frost, that he could not walk away. He could not leave this child to the mercy of a world that had already shown him none. The vow formed in the silence of his heart, a quiet, unbreakable covenant. He would find the truth. He would protect this boy. He would become the shield Sarah could no longer be. The ghosts of his past, his wife, his own daughter, lost so long ago, receded, replaced by the immediate, desperate reality of the small, shivering child before him. His annual pilgrimage of grief was over. A new mission had just begun. Arthur made his decision with the swift, cold clarity that had saved his life a dozen times over. He gently scooped the boy into his arms. Leo stiffened, a rigid little plank of fear, but he did not cry out. He was a child who had learned the futility of protest. His silence was more damning than any scream. Arthur held him close, trying to transfer some of his own warmth into the boy's chilled frame, and was struck by how little he weighed. He felt fragile, like a bird with hollow bones. He carried him to his own car, strapping him into the passenger seat and pulling the belt tight across his small chest. The boy's wide, vacant eyes watched him, unblinking. There was no trust in them, but there was no active fear either. It was a state of pure, resigned observation. He drove the short distance to Richard's house, a sprawling modern structure of glass and steel that stood on a hill overlooking the town. It was a monument to success, cold and imposing. It was not the warm, welcoming home Sarah had described in her letters. As he pulled into the long, curving driveway, he saw the black SUV was already there. Eleanor was standing on the porch, her arms crossed, her face a mask of controlled fury. She was beautiful, in a sharp, angular way, with perfectly coiffed dark hair and a designer coat that probably cost more than Arthur's monthly mortgage. She saw him, and her expression instantly morphed into one of saccharine relief. It was a masterful, instantaneous transformation. "Oh, thank God!" she exclaimed, rushing down the pristine stone steps. "Arthur, I was just about to call the police. I turned my back for 1 second, to place some flowers, and he just vanished. Leo is such a little wanderer. You found him. Thank you, thank you." Her voice was a symphony of practiced concern. Arthur got out of the car, his movements deliberate. He did not respond to her performance. He opened the passenger door and unbuckled Leo. The boy shrank away from Eleanor's outstretched arms, pressing himself against Arthur's leg. It was the first real choice Arthur had seen him make. He was alone in the parking lot for at least 15 minutes, Arthur stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The keys were in the ignition. The door was unlocked. Eleanor's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of cold annoyance crossed her features before being expertly concealed. "Oh, my goodness, was it that long?" It felt like a lifetime, but also just a moment. "I was so frantic. You know how it is. Time plays tricks on you when you're terrified." She reached for Leo again, her voice dripping with cloying sweetness. "Come here, sweetie. Mommy was so worried." Leo burrowed his face into Arthur's trousers, his little hands gripping the coarse fabric. Arthur placed a protective hand on the boy's head. "I think he'll stay with me for a moment," he said. His gaze met Eleanor's, and in that silent exchange, a war was declared. She saw he did not believe her. He saw the predator behind the mask. "Of course," she said, her voice tightening almost imperceptibly. "He's probably just shaken up. Please come inside. Richard will be home soon. He'll be so thrilled to see you. What a surprise." Arthur followed her into the house. The interior was like a magazine spread. Sterile, immaculate, and utterly devoid of warmth. White walls, minimalist furniture, and abstract art. There were no toys strewn about, no childish fingerprints on the glass tables, no sign that a 3-year-old boy actually lived there. It was a showroom, not a home. He was led into a formal living room and told to wait. Eleanor disappeared with Leo, her hand clamped firmly on his small shoulder, pulling him along despite his resistance. Arthur heard a door click shut down a long hallway, followed by the faint, unmistakable sound of a key turning in a lock. The blood in his veins turned to ice. He waited. The silence of the house was heavy, oppressive. It was the silence of things unsaid, of truths buried. After 20 minutes, Richard Denton arrived. He was softer than Arthur remembered, his face etched with the lines of chronic stress, his expensive suit looking a size too big for him. He registered Arthur's presence with a look of weary surprise. "Arthur? What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice lacking any real warmth. "I found your son, alone, in the cemetery parking lot," Arthur said, cutting straight to the point. Richard's face paled. "What?" "Eleanor just called me. She said he wandered off for a second and you happened to be there. She said she was a wreck." "She left him there," Arthur corrected him. "The car was running. He was cold, and he has a bruise on his face." At that moment, Eleanor re-entered the room, a tray with glasses of water in her hands, her composure perfectly restored. "Oh, darling, thank goodness you're home. I was just telling Arthur about the scare we had." "And that bruise?" she said, shaking her head with a practiced sigh. "He took such a tumble at the playground yesterday. He's so clumsy at this age. I put a cold pack on it right away." She placed the tray on the coffee table, a perfect hostess. Her story was seamless, plausible, a masterclass in gaslighting. Richard looked from his wife to Arthur, his expression a mixture of confusion and a desperate desire for this confrontation to simply end. "Well, all's well that ends well, I suppose. It's good to see you, Arthur. Though the circumstances are strange." "I'd like to see Leo," Arthur said, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. "Oh, he's sleeping," she replied quickly, a little too quickly. The poor little thing was just exhausted after all the excitement. It's best not to wake him. The lie was so blatant it was insulting. Arthur knew the boy was awake, alone in a locked room down the hall. He looked at Richard, his brother-in-law, and saw a man who had abdicated his role as a father, outsourcing it to this cold, manipulative woman, choosing a life of peaceful ignorance over the difficult truth. He had chosen the easy lie over the hard reality. In that moment, Arthur's quiet vow solidified into a concrete plan. He would not fight them here, in their sterile fortress. This was not a battle to be won with raised voices. It was a war that would be won with patience, with evidence, and with the relentless application of truth. "I see," Arthur said, rising to his feet. "I'm staying in town for a while, at the old motel off the highway. I'll be in touch." Eleanor's smile was triumphant. She had won this round. "Of course, we should all have dinner soon. Properly catch up." Arthur walked out of the house without another word, the sterile cold of the place clinging to him like a shroud. As he drove away, he looked back at the perfect house on the hill. It was a beautiful lie, and inside it, his nephew was a prisoner. The rage was back, cold and sharp, honing his focus. He was no longer just a grieving brother. He was a soldier with a mission. He would dismantle their perfect world, brick by brick, lie by lie, until the small boy inside was free. The hunt had begun. The first phase of Arthur's operation was reconnaissance. He checked into the Pine Ridge Motel, a relic from a bygone era with a flickering neon sign and the persistent smell of damp pine cleaner. It was anonymous, affordable, and offered a clear, if distant, view of the Denton house on the hill. From his second-story room, using a pair of military-grade binoculars, he could watch the comings and goings, the patterns of life that revealed more than any conversation ever could. He became a ghost, a patient observer cataloging the rhythms of the prison. He watched for 3 days straight, subsisting on stale coffee and protein bars. The routine was chillingly consistent. Richard left for the city in his sleek sedan at 6:30 a.m. and returned after 8 p.m. Eleanor would emerge around 10 a.m., dressed for the gym or a lunch meeting, her black SUV gleaming as she drove away. She was often gone for hours at a time. During these periods, the house was still. No small face ever appeared in a window. No child played in the sprawling, manicured yard. The expensive swing set Sarah had bought for Leo just before she died sat motionless, a monument to a childhood that wasn't happening. Leo was only visible during brief, controlled moments. A trip to the grocery store where he sat silently in the cart, his expression blank. A walk to the mailbox where Eleanor's hand gripped his arm with unnecessary force. He never ran. He never laughed. He was an accessory, a prop in the perfect life Eleanor projected to the world. Arthur meticulously logged every observation in a small, black notebook. Times, durations, interactions, weather conditions. It was the same process he had used to track enemy movements in hostile territory. The enemy, this time, wore designer clothes and drove a luxury vehicle. On the 4th day, he decided to approach the perimeter. He needed a source on the ground. He put on a pair of worn work clothes, grabbed a rake from the motel's forgotten tool shed, and began clearing leaves along the public road that bordered the Dentons' property. He was just another faceless laborer, invisible. He worked his way slowly towards the house next door, a modest, older home with a lovingly tended garden. An elderly woman was pruning her rose bushes. She watched him with a curious, cautious eye. Mrs. Gable, according to the name on the mailbox. "Afternoon," Arthur said, leaning on his rake. "Quite a wind we had last night." The woman, Mrs. Gable, offered a tight, non-committal smile. "It certainly was. Beautiful house they have there," Arthur said, nodding towards the Denton residence. "Must be nice, living next to such a perfect family." He loaded the words with just enough insincerity to be noticeable. Mrs. Gable's smile vanished. She snipped a dead rose from its stem with a vicious snap of her shears. "Appearances," she muttered, "more to her roses than to him. That's all some people care about." Arthur waited, silent. He knew how to handle reluctant witnesses. You don't push. You create a space and let their conscience fill it. "I hear things, sometimes," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She glanced nervously toward the glass and steel monstrosity next door. "Crying. A lot of crying. And yelling. Her voice. It gets so sharp. So cold. Not like when she's out here, talking about her charity work." "Have you ever seen the boy?" Arthur asked, his voice neutral. "Leo," she said, the name soft with pity. "I see him. Sometimes she leaves him in the backyard. Just leaves him. For hours. Doesn't matter if it's hot or cold. He just sits on the steps. He never plays on that swing set. Never. And sometimes I hear a door slam, and the crying stops. Just like that. The silence is worse than the noise," she shivered, despite the mild afternoon sun. "I thought about calling someone, but she's an important woman in this town. Her husband, too. What would I say? That a child is too quiet? They'd think I was a meddling old fool." "You're not a fool," Arthur said quietly. "You're a good neighbor." He had what he needed, the first external corroboration of his suspicions. He thanked the woman for her time and went back to his motel room, the information a cold, hard stone in his gut. The yelling, the isolation, the silence. It was a classic pattern of psychological abuse and neglect. His next step was to try and establish a line of communication with Leo himself. He knew a direct approach was impossible. He needed a pretext. The following afternoon, knowing Eleanor was at her weekly yoga class, he drove to the house. He parked on the street and walked up the driveway, carrying a small, brightly wrapped box. He rang the doorbell. After a long moment, the door opened a crack. A young woman in a nanny's uniform, no older than 20, looked out, her expression nervous. "Can I help you?" she asked. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said calmly. "I'm Leo's uncle. I was in town and wanted to drop off a late birthday present for him." The nanny, whose name tag read Chloe, hesitated. "Mrs. Denton didn't say you were coming. It was a last-minute thing. I won't stay, I just wanted to make sure he got this." He held out the box. Inside was a simple set of crayons and a thick pad of drawing paper. "I remember my sister saying how much he loved to draw." Chloe's eyes softened. She was young and likely intimidated by Eleanor. "Okay," she said, taking the box. "I'll make sure he gets it." "How is he?" Arthur asked, his tone casual. The girl's professional mask slipped for a moment. A shadow of concern crossed her face. "He's quiet," she said, then seemed to regret the admission. "He's a very quiet boy. I have to go. Mrs. Denton will be back soon." She shut the door, leaving Arthur on the porch. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. He had inserted a tool into the prison. A tool for a child who had no words. Now all he could do was wait and hope the boy would use it. He returned to his observation post, his binoculars trained on the house, his heart a heavy, anxious drum in his chest. He was fighting a war of whispers and shadows, and the fate of a silent little boy hung in the balance. The package of crayons became Arthur's Trojan horse. For days nothing happened. He continued his surveillance, the routine of the house a grim, unchanging tableau. Richard's long hours, Eleanor's socialite schedule, Leo's near invisibility. The silence from the house was a void he couldn't penetrate. He began to fear his gambit had failed, that the crayons and paper were locked away in a closet, another piece of forbidden childhood joy. But then, on the 5th day after he had delivered his gift, the dynamic shifted. He was watching the house in the late afternoon when the sanitation truck made its weekly rounds. He saw Chloe, the young nanny, drag the large recycling and trash bins to the curb. It was a small, mundane detail, but Arthur's training had taught him that intelligence often hid in the mundane. He waited until the truck had come and gone, and until Chloe had retreated back inside the sterile fortress. Then, under the cover of the gathering dusk, he made his move. He drove his car to the end of the street, parked and walked back, his steps quiet on the asphalt. The air was cold and smelled of rain. He approached the Denton's bins, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. He lifted the lid of the recycling bin first. It was mostly empty, save for a few wine bottles and glossy magazines. Then he opened the trash bin, and there, lying on top of a bag of coffee grounds and vegetable peelings, was the drawing pad. His hands, steady under enemy fire, trembled slightly as he lifted it out. Felt like sacrilege, pulling this piece of a child's soul from the garbage. Most of the pages were blank, but 3 of them had been used. He carefully tore them from the spiral binding and tucked them inside his jacket, leaving the pad behind. He retreated to his car, his mind racing. Why would Eleanor throw it away? Was it an act of simple tidiness, or something more sinister? Back in the dim, lonely light of his motel room, he laid the drawings out on the worn bedspread. They were the frantic, untutored scribbles of a 3-year-old, but they told a story more eloquent than any words. The first drawing was a chaotic swirl of black and gray crayon, a vortex of darkness that seemed to suck all the light from the page. In the center was a small, stick-figure person, colored in a faint, hesitant blue. The figure had no arms, no mouth. It was a portrait of powerlessness. The second drawing was more structured and more chilling. It depicted a house, a large, black box with a single, square window high up on the wall. Inside the window, the same small, blue figure was visible. Outside the house stood a much larger figure, drawn in an angry, aggressive red. This figure had long, sharp lines for arms and a jagged, frowning mouth. The red figure was holding something long and thin, a key. A heavy, dark line was drawn from the red figure to a large, elaborate lock on the door of the black house. The symbolism was brutal and unmistakable. A prisoner and his jailer. But it was the third drawing that made Arthur's blood run cold. It was a close-up of a face. The face of the red figure. It was a furious, contorted mask of rage. Jagged teeth, wild, circular eyes. And emanating from the mouth were sharp, spiky lines, like daggers, all pointing at a tiny, cowering blue figure in the corner of the page. It was a drawing of a child being verbally assaulted, an illustration of words used as weapons. And in the bottom corner of the page, almost as an afterthought, Leo had drawn something else. He had drawn the bruise on his own cheek, a small purple smudge, right where Arthur had seen it. This was it. This was the nonverbal testimony he had been hoping for. It was raw, it was damning, and it came directly from the victim. Eleanor hadn't just thrown away a drawing pad. She had tried to throw away the evidence of her cruelty. She had seen these drawings and understood their meaning, and she had tried to erase them. Arthur carefully placed the drawings into a protective plastic sleeve. They were more valuable than any satellite photo, more conclusive than any intercepted communication. He knew this wasn't enough for a court of law. A child's drawings could be interpreted in 100 different ways by a skilled and ruthless lawyer. He needed something undeniable, something concrete. He needed to get inside the house. His mind turned to technology, to cameras and microphones. But the risk of planting a device was immense. If discovered, Eleanor would use it to paint him as a deranged stalker, destroying his credibility forever. He needed another way in. His thoughts turned to Richard. Weak, passive, willfully blind Richard. He had once been Arthur's friend, before he had become his brother-in-law. They had bonded over a shared love of vintage motorcycles. Years ago, Richard, a tech enthusiast, had set up a state-of-the-art smart home and security system. He had been so proud of it, he had given Arthur the guest login credentials. Just in case of an emergency, he'd said, "If you ever need to check on Sarah while I'm traveling." Arthur had never used it. After Sarah's death and his falling out with Richard, he had deleted the information, wanting to sever all ties. But his memory, honed by years of memorizing codes and procedures, was a steel trap. He sat down at the small desk, opened his laptop, and his fingers hovered over the keyboard. He could remember the login page, the specific sequence of letters and numbers. It was a long shot. Surely Richard or Eleanor would have changed the guest password in the last 2 years. It would be an insane lapse in security. He typed in the address for the security system's web portal. The login screen appeared. He took a deep breath and entered the old username, Avance Usurgest. Then the password, Sarah Lily, 1984. His sister's name, his own lost daughter's name, the year of his marriage. A password born of a time when their families were intertwined. He hit enter. For a second, the screen buffered. He expected the red access denied message. Instead, the screen refreshed and the system's dashboard appeared. He was in. He couldn't believe it. The sheer, arrogant negligence of it. They had never bothered to change it. He now had access to the home's entire digital nervous system, thermostats, lighting, and, most importantly, the cloud storage for every security camera in and around the house. There were cameras covering the front door, the backyard, the driveway, the main living area, and the kitchen. He began to sift through the archives, his focus absolute. He skipped through weeks of footage, looking for the moments when Eleanor and Leo were alone. He found it. An event from 3 days ago, logged as motion-detected living room. The timestamp corresponded to a period when he knew Richard was at work. The video began. Eleanor was on the phone, pacing back and forth in the immaculate living room, laughing with a friend. In the background, Leo was playing quietly on the floor with a single wooden block. He wasn't making a sound. Then, as he reached for the block, he accidentally knocked over a tall, thin, ridiculously expensive-looking vase from a low side table. It shattered on the polished concrete floor. The change in Eleanor was instantaneous and terrifying. The smiling, relaxed woman vanished. She spun around, her face a mask of incandescent rage. "You stupid, clumsy little brat!" she shrieked. her voice a venomous hiss that the high-fidelity microphone picked up with perfect clarity. Leo froze, his eyes wide with terror. He looked like a mouse cornered by a snake. "Look what you did. Do you know how much that cost? More than you will ever be worth." She stalked towards him. Leo scrambled backwards, trying to crab walk away from her, his hands slipping on the smooth floor. She grabbed him by the arm, yanking him to his feet. "You are more trouble than you are worth. Just like your mother was." The camera angle was perfect. It captured the moment she raised her hand, the moment Leo cowered, and the hard, vicious slap across his face. It captured the sound, a sickening crack that made Arthur flinch. It captured Leo's silent, shocked tears as she dragged him, kicking and stumbling, out of the frame and down the hallway towards his room. A moment later, the camera recorded the sound of his bedroom door slamming shut and the key turning in the lock. Arthur sat back, his breathing ragged. His hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists. The rage was a living thing inside him, a white-hot inferno. He had the smoking gun. He had the undeniable, irrefutable proof. He downloaded the video file, then a dozen more just like it. Clips of her screaming at the boy for spilling juice. A clip of her locking him outside in the cold rain for an hour because he wouldn't stop crying. A clip of her mocking him, mimicking his whimpers in a cruel, childish voice. It was a library of horrors. He meticulously logged out, erasing any digital trace of his access. He now held the key to Eleanor's destruction. But he knew he had to use it carefully. A frontal assault could still backfire. He needed a professional. He needed an ally who could turn this raw, emotional evidence into a legal weapon of overwhelming force. He thought of his old unit. There was only one man for the job. A man who had traded his rifle for a briefcase but had never lost his killer instinct. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for Marcus Thorne, Esquire. The war was about to enter a new, final, and decisive phase. Marcus Thorne's law office was the antithesis of the Pine Ridge Motel. Located on the top floor of a gleaming skyscraper in the city, it was a space of quiet, intimidating power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the urban sprawl, and the air smelled of expensive leather and ambition. Marcus himself was just as imposing. He was a mountain of a man, with a mind as sharp as a shard of glass. He and Arthur had served 2 tours together, forging a bond in the crucible of combat that time and distance had not eroded. When Arthur walked in, Marcus rose from behind his massive mahogany desk and enveloped him in a brief, bone-crushing hug. "Vance," he rumbled, his voice a deep baritone, "you look like hell. What trouble have you gotten yourself into now?" "It's not my trouble," Arthur said, his voice tight. He sat down and, without preamble, laid out the 3 drawings on the polished surface of the desk. He then placed his laptop beside them and played the video of Eleanor striking Leo. He said nothing, letting the evidence speak for itself. Marcus watched the video, his jovial expression melting away, replaced by a cold, professional fury. The jovial lawyer vanished, and the predator Arthur remembered from the battlefield emerged. His eyes narrowed, and a muscle feathered in his jaw. When the video ended, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the frozen image of Eleanor's enraged face. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Eleanor Denton, the new wife of my brother-in-law, Richard Denton. The boy is my nephew, Leo." Marcus swiveled in his chair and stared out at the city below. "Denton as in Denton Capital? Richard Denton is a major player. This woman, Eleanor, she's a socialite. Chairs half a dozen children's charity boards. She has a reputation as a saint." He turned back to face Arthur. "This is a bomb, Arthur. A nuke. If we just hand this to the police or CPS, her lawyers will bury it in motions. They'll claim the video was doctored, that the drawings are meaningless. They'll paint you as a disgruntled, unstable relative with a grudge. They will drag that little boy through a legal hell that will be almost as damaging as the abuse itself. So what do we do?" Arthur asked, the frustration evident in his voice. "We can't just let this continue." "No, we don't let it continue," Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with strategic fire. We don't engage in a battle of attrition. We orchestrate an execution. We need to choose the time and place of her destruction so that it is absolute, public, and inescapable. We need to detonate this bomb in a room where she has no cover, no escape, and no allies. For the next hour, they planned. Marcus was a master strategist, seeing the legal and social battlefield with breathtaking clarity. He explained that they needed to build a comprehensive file. The video was the centerpiece, but it needed supporting evidence. They needed sworn affidavits. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Gable," Marcus said, tapping a pen on a legal pad. "We need her on record. I'll send a private investigator, a woman very gentle, very discreet. She'll get a statement. And the nanny, Chloe. She's a risk, but she's also a potential key. She's likely terrified of Eleanor. We need to offer her a way out, legal protection, a new job. We need to get her on our side." Arthur gave him all the information he had gathered in his notebook. The meticulous logs of Eleanor's comings and goings, the nanny's full name, the address of Mrs. Gable. Marcus's fingers flew across his keyboard, dispatching emails, setting his formidable machine in motion. "Now for the venue," Marcus mused, leaning back in his chair. "We need a place where her public image is at its most inflated. Where the fall will be the hardest." He did a quick search on his computer. A slow, wolfish grin spread across his face. "Oh, this is perfect. In 2 weeks, Eleanor Denton is the guest of honor and keynote speaker at the annual, for the Children's Future, fundraising gala. It's the biggest charity event of the year in that region. The press will be there. The mayor will be there. Half the city's elite will be in that ballroom, hanging on her every word about protecting the innocent." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. "We can't," Arthur said, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. "It's too public. Too much of a circus." "That's exactly why we must," Marcus countered, leaning forward, his intensity filling the room. "Arthur, men like us were used to solving problems in the shadows. But this kind of evil, the kind that hides behind a beautiful face and a charitable donation, it thrives in the dark. It festers in the he said, she said of a quiet legal battle. The only way to kill it is with sunlight. We need to expose her so completely, so catastrophically, that there is no doubt, no debate, and no escape. We have to rip the mask off in front of the entire world she has so carefully built." Arthur looked at the drawings again, at the small, mouthless blue figure. He thought of Leo, locked in his room, his spirit being systematically eroded. Marcus was right. A quiet victory wouldn't be enough. Eleanor didn't just need to be stopped. She needed to be erased. Her entire false identity needed to be publicly dismantled so that she could never harm another child again. "Okay," Arthur said, the single word a surrender and a commitment. "What do you need me to do?" "Go back to your motel. Keep watching. Keep logging. Do not, under any circumstances, engage with her or Richard. You are a ghost. My team will handle the rest. I'll get a court order for temporary custody lined up, ready to be signed by an emergency judge the moment the curtain falls. We'll have CPS agents waiting in the wings. We will coordinate everything. All you have to do is be ready. When I give the signal, we move." Arthur left the office feeling a shift in the air. The heavy burden he had been carrying alone was now shared. He was no longer a lone operative. He was part of a team again. The fight was no longer just his. As he drove back to the small town, the setting sun cast long shadows across the road, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the promise of a dawn. The plan was in motion. The trap was being set. In 2 weeks, at a glittering gala celebrating her supposed love for children, Eleanor Denton's world was going to burn to the ground. The 2 weeks leading up to the gala were the longest of Arthur's life. He followed Marcus's instructions to the letter, maintaining his silent vigil from the motel room. He was a ghost, a patient hunter waiting for the moment to strike. Marcus's team worked with silent, terrifying efficiency. A discreet female investigator, posing as a census taker, had a long, tearful conversation with Mrs. Gable, who unburdened herself of 2 years of suspicion and fear signing a sworn affidavit that detailed the screaming, the crying, and the chilling, sudden silences. The nanny, Chloe, was a more delicate operation. Marcus's firm reached out to her through a third party, offering free legal counsel for an employment issue. Terrified but desperate, she met with one of Marcus's junior associates in a quiet coffee shop miles from town. She confessed everything. The locked door, the withheld meals, the constant verbal abuse. She spoke of how Eleanor would be sweet as honey one moment and a raging monster the next. She admitted that she had seen Eleanor strike the child on several occasions, but she was a student, working to pay her tuition, and Eleanor had threatened to ruin her reputation and ensure she'd never work with children again if she ever spoke a word. With the promise of legal protection and a new, better-paying job lined up by Marcus's vast network, Chloe signed her own affidavit, her hands shaking as she did so. During this time, Eleanor seemed to sense a change in the atmosphere. Perhaps it was Arthur's initial appearance, a stone tossed into the placid pond of her life, the ripples still spreading. She became more careful. The yelling stopped. Leo was seen in the yard more often, though he still just sat on the steps, a small, lonely figure. Eleanor began a subtle counteroffensive. Arthur learned from Marcus, who had his own intelligence sources, that Eleanor was telling her friends a carefully crafted story. She spoke of her troubled brother-in-law, a traumatized veteran, who had become unhealthily fixated on Leo after the tragic loss of his own family. She painted herself as a victim, patiently enduring the harassment of a disturbed man, all while trying to provide a stable home for her difficult stepson. It was a brilliant, insidious move. She was preemptively discrediting her accuser, seeding doubt among her powerful friends. She was building a firewall of sympathy and plausible deniability. The news only hardened Marcus's resolve. "She's smart. I'll give her that," he had said over the phone. "She knows a threat is coming. She just doesn't know what it looks like. She's shoring up her defenses. It won't matter. A castle wall is useless when the enemy is already inside." The day of the gala arrived. A cold, clear night with a sky full of stars. Arthur stood in front of the mirror in his motel room, adjusting the knot on a simple black tie. He wore a dark, well-fitted suit Marcus had sent over. He looked like a different man, no longer the grieving recluse or the invisible workman. He looked like a soldier in dress uniform, ready for a final, solemn duty. He felt a profound calm settle over him. The anger was still there, a cold, dense star in his core, but it was focused, controlled, a source of energy rather than heat. Marcus picked him up. He was also in a dark suit, looking more like a head of state's bodyguard than a lawyer. In the back of the car, a stoic woman with kind eyes sat quietly. "This is Dr. Evans," Marcus said. "She's one of the top child psychologists in the state and a certified CPS evaluator. She's our immediate after-action care. And she'll be an official witness." The woman nodded at Arthur, her expression conveying a deep, compassionate understanding. The final pieces were in place. They drove to the grand ballroom of the Oak Valley Country Club. It was a scene of opulent splendor. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over hundreds of guests in tuxedos and evening gowns. The air hummed with champagne-fueled chatter and the soft music of a string quartet. And at the center of it all was Eleanor. She was radiant in a shimmering silver gown, moving through the crowd with the grace of a queen, accepting compliments, her laughter bright and tinkling. Richard stood beside her, looking uncomfortable but proud, a handsome accessory to his wife's triumph. Arthur, Marcus, and Dr. Evans entered quietly, taking a position at the back of the room near the main audiovisual control booth, which Marcus had arranged to have manned by one of his own tech experts. They were invisible, just 3 more faces in the glittering crowd. They watched as the evening progressed. Speeches were made. Pledges were given. Finally, the master of ceremonies, a local news anchor, took the stage. "And now," he boomed, his voice resonating through the hall, "it is my distinct honor to introduce a woman whose tireless dedication to the well-being of our community's children is an inspiration to us all, a true angel among us. Please welcome our guest of honor, Mrs. Eleanor Denton." The room erupted in thunderous applause. Eleanor glided onto the stage, beaming, waving to her adoring audience. She stepped up to the podium, which stood in front of a massive projection screen currently displaying the charity's logo. She looked out at the sea of faces, her own face a perfect portrait of humility and grace. "Thank you," she began, her voice smooth and confident. "Thank you all so much. When I look out at all of your generous faces, I am reminded that it truly does take a village to protect a child. Our most precious, our most vulnerable. They look to us to be their shield, to be their voice." That was the signal. "Now," Marcus whispered into a small radio. At the control booth, the technician hit a button. The charity logo on the giant screen behind Eleanor vanished, replaced by the sterile, wide-angle view of her own living room. The image was crystal clear. Eleanor, mid-sentence, faltered. She glanced behind her, a flicker of confusion on her face. The crowd murmured, assuming it was a technical glitch. And then the audio kicked in. Her own voice, not the smooth, measured tone from the podium, but a shrill, venomous shriek, filled the cavernous ballroom. "You stupid, clumsy little brat." The collective gasp from the audience was a physical thing, a sudden vacuum in the room. On the screen, the entire scene played out in horrifying high definition. The vase shattering, the terror on Leo's tiny face, the slap, the sound of the blow, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, echoed through the silent hall like a gunshot. Eleanor froze. The blood drained from her face. She looked like a statue carved from ice. She stared at the screen, at her own monstrous image, her mask of public virtue incinerated in an instant. The video continued, showing her dragging the crying child down the hall. The sound of the door slamming and the key turning in the lock was the final, damning punctuation mark. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, profound, and heavy with judgment. Every eye in the room was on Eleanor, no longer with adoration, but with a dawning, unified horror. Her perfect world had ceased to exist in the space of 30 seconds. Arthur began to walk from the back of the room, his steps steady and deliberate on the plush carpet. Marcus was beside him. The crowd parted for them as if they were surgeons approaching a critical patient. All eyes followed their slow, inexorable advance toward the stage. Eleanor's composure finally shattered. Her face twisted into a snarl of pure hatred, the same face from the video, the same face from Leo's drawing. "You!" she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur. "He did this. He's a sick, obsessed man. He doctored that video. He's been stalking me." Richard, his face ashen, looked from the screen to his wife to Arthur. His mind finally, brutally forced to confront the truth he had so long avoided. "Is it doctored, Eleanor?" Arthur's voice was quiet, yet it carried through the silent hall. He stopped at the foot of the stage, holding up his phone. He had queued up another file. He pressed play. The sound of her voice filled the air again, this time from a different clip. "You are more trouble than you are worth, just like your mother was." That was the blow that broke Richard. A choked sob escaped his lips. He stumbled back from his wife as if she were radioactive. "And is this doctored?" Arthur continued, his voice relentless. He held up the drawings one by one. The black vortex, the house with the lock, the red face with the jagged teeth. He didn't need to explain them. The entire room understood. They had just seen the red face in the flesh. Eleanor's frantic denials died in her throat. She was trapped, exposed under the glare of 100 pairs of eyes. Her lies were useless. Her beautiful facade was a pile of dust at her feet. She looked wildly around the room, searching for an ally, a friendly face, but found only disgust and condemnation. Her reign was over. At that moment, 2 uniformed police officers, who had been waiting discreetly by the entrance, began to make their way through the crowd. Marcus had timed it perfectly. As they reached the stage, Eleanor finally broke. It was not a confession of remorse, but a pathetic, screeching tantrum of a thwarted tyrant. "He's a monster. she screamed, her voice cracking. That little boy is a monster. He is a difficult, manipulative, horrible child. He deserved it. He deserved all of it. The admission, raw and hateful, hung in the air, sealing her fate more surely than any video. The officers ascended the stage. One of them began to read Eleanor her rights as the other gently but firmly placed her hands behind her back. The clicking of the handcuffs was the only sound in the room. The saint of the children's charity was being arrested for child abuse at her own gala. The justice was poetic, brutal, and absolute. As Eleanor was led away, a sobbing, defeated shell of a woman, Arthur's eyes found Richard. The man was broken, weeping openly, the full weight of his willful blindness crashing down upon him. He had failed his son. He had failed Sarah. There would be a long road ahead for him, but the spell was broken. Dr. Evans was already on the phone, speaking quietly with the emergency judge. Marcus clasped Arthur's shoulder. "It's done," he said softly. "Phase 1 is complete." Arthur nodded, a profound, bone-deep weariness washing over him, but it was mingled with the clean, sharp feeling of a mission accomplished. He had kept his vow. He had given a voice to the silent. He had brought the monster out of the shadows and into the light. The war was over. Now the long, quiet work of healing could begin. The aftermath of the gala was a swift and merciless tide of justice. Eleanor Denton's fall from grace was spectacular and absolute. The story was a media firestorm, the video from the gala going viral within hours. Her powerful friends abandoned her instantly, scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. The charities she had once championed issued formal statements of condemnation. Stripped of her wealth, her influence, and her carefully constructed identity, she was left with nothing but the ugly truth of who she was. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, the videos, the sworn testimony from Mrs. Gable and Chloe, and Richard's full, tearful confession, she accepted a plea bargain to avoid a trial that would have publicly aired every last detail of her cruelty. She was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, her name becoming a local cautionary tale, a synonym for hidden evil. Richard, consumed by guilt and shame, cooperated fully with the authorities. He voluntarily surrendered his parental rights to Arthur, acknowledging that he was in no state to care for Leo. The court agreed, mandating intensive therapy and a long-term parenting assessment before he would even be considered for supervised visitation. His empire of wealth could not buy him absolution. He had lost his son through his own weakness, a punishment more profound than any prison sentence. With the legal battles concluded, Arthur's true mission began: the restoration of a stolen childhood. The court granted him full legal guardianship of Leo. The first thing he did was sell his own small, empty house, the one that echoed with the ghosts of his past. He took the proceeds, along with a portion of the trust Sarah had left for Leo, and bought a small, unassuming cottage by the sea. It was the complete opposite of the Denton's glass and steel mansion. It was old, made of wood that smelled of salt and sun, with a rambling garden that ended where the sand dunes began. It was a place for healing. The first few months were a study in quiet patience. Leo remained mostly silent, a little ghost haunting the edges of their new life. He would flinch at sudden movements and loud noises. He never cried, as if the ability to express that particular sadness had been burned out of him. Arthur never pushed. He simply created a world of unwavering safety and predictability. They had breakfast at the same time every morning. They took long walks on the beach in the afternoon, collecting shells and watching the seabirds. Arthur would talk to him in a low, steady voice, narrating their day, pointing out the shapes of clouds or the color of a passing fishing boat, filling the silence without demanding a response. He filled the small cottage with things a child needed: wooden toys, soft blankets, and books with colorful pictures. He hung Leo's drawings, the new ones, on the refrigerator. The dark, angry scribbles began to slowly recede, replaced by hesitant drawings of seagulls and waves, mostly in shades of blue and gray. Arthur waited. He knew that trust, like a shattered bone, had to be set carefully and given time to knit back together. The breakthrough came on a cool autumn afternoon, almost a year to the day since he had found Leo in the cemetery parking lot. They were in the garden, digging in the dirt, planting bulbs for the spring. A monarch butterfly, bright and impossibly orange, landed on a late-blooming marigold near Leo's hand. The boy froze, his eyes wide with wonder. He watched it for a long, silent moment as it gently fanned its wings. Then he looked up at Arthur, his blue eyes clear and present for the first time. A tiny, hesitant smile touched his lips. He pointed a small, dirt-smudged finger at the butterfly. "Pretty," he whispered. The word was so soft Arthur almost missed it. It was the first unsolicited word Leo had spoken to him. It was a key turning in a lock, opening a door that had been sealed for a very long time. Arthur felt a stinging in his own eyes, a warmth spreading through his chest that pushed back years of accumulated cold and grief. He smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Yes, Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's very pretty." From that day forward, the words began to come, first as a trickle, then as a steady stream. He began to ask questions. He began to laugh, a sound so pure and startlingly beautiful it seemed to make the sun shine brighter. He started having nightmares, reliving the dark room and the angry red face. But now, when he woke up screaming, Arthur was there to hold him, to tell him he was safe, that the monster was gone and would never come back. The tears he had been unable to cry for so long finally came, and with them, a cleansing of the deep, hidden wounds. One evening, as Arthur was tucking him into bed, Leo threw his small arms around his neck and held on tight. "I love you, Uncle Arthur," he said, his voice clear and strong, his breath warm against Arthur's cheek. Arthur held him close, the small, solid weight of the boy in his arms an anchor to this new life. The ghosts of his past, his wife, his daughter, were still there, but they were no longer figures of sorrow. They were a quiet, peaceful presence, a part of the man he had become. He had been a soldier, a protector of the innocent in faraway lands. But his true purpose, he now understood, was here, in this small cottage by the sea, protecting this one precious boy. He had not just rescued Leo. In saving him, he had also, finally, saved himself. He had found a way to build a new family from the ashes of the old, proving that the deepest wounds can heal, and that even after the longest, darkest night, the sun will eventually rise. In the quiet tapestry of our lives, evil often does not announce itself with thunder and lightning, but with a pleasant smile and a well-timed donation. It thrives in the shadows we create, in the truths we are too busy, too afraid, or too comfortable to question. The story of Arthur and Leo is a stark reminder that the most pristine facades can hide the darkest cellars, and the most vulnerable among us often have no voice to cry for help. It begs us to look closer, to listen to the silences as much as the screams, and to trust the instinct that tells us when something is profoundly wrong. What does it take for a good person to intervene? And how many silent victims are waiting for their own protector to arrive? True strength is not the power to dominate, to control, or to build an empire of beautiful lies. It is the quiet courage to shield the weak, to stand for the truth even when it is inconvenient, and to offer a safe harbor to those lost in a storm. Arthur Vance was a man broken by loss, but in his brokenness, he found a deeper, more resilient kind of strength, the strength to heal another, and in doing so, to heal himself. Their journey from a cold parking lot to a warm seaside home is a testament to the enduring power of compassion in a world too often ruled by cruelty. We would be honored to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever witnessed a situation where your intuition told you something was wrong, even if everything looked perfect on the surface? Have you ever seen the quiet courage of a protector change someone's life? Your stories and reflections are a vital part of this conversation. Thank you for reading, and may we all find the strength to be a shield for someone who needs one.